I would like to start by welcoming everyone to this event hosted by Ethics and International Affairs, the Journal of the Carnegie Council. My name is Scott Sagan. I'm a professor of political science and co-director of the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University. This panel was brought together as an extension of a collection of essays that were published recently in Ethics and International Affairs that considered the lessons of Joseph Nye's landmark 1986 book, Nuclear Ethics, and proposed a set of ideas for changing and for reevaluating nuclear ethics today. And it's within that framework that we've organized this event. We'll be discussing how to think about the ethics of nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence in our current world. Before we begin, however, it's important to recognize that today, August 9th, is the anniversary of the bombing of Nagasaki, which together with the bombing of Hiroshima a few days earlier killed between 130 and 230,000 people, most of whom were children, women, men, civilians, not military. This stands as a sobering reminder of the massive human cost the use of nuclear weapons would entail and the exceedingly high stakes at play whenever we discuss these issues. And I'm honored today to be joined by two distinguished panelists. Sharon Weiner is the Associate Professor of International Relations at the School of International Service at American University. Her most recent book is Managing the Military, the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Civil Military Relations. And Sharon published a superb article, The Ethics of Choosing Deterrence in Ethics in International Affairs, in our special symposium. The second panelist is Tatsuo Suzuki, the Vice Director and Professor of the Research Center for Nuclear Weapons Abolition in Nagasaki. Thank you for joining us. Tatsuo's most recent co-authored books include Learning from Fukushima, Nuclear Power in East Asia. Tatsuo and I recently worked together in Hiroshima last month on the Hiroshima Roundtable, assessing the risks of nuclear war today. I'd like to start with you, Tatsuo, noting that since this is the anniversary of the Nagasaki bombing, I wonder if you can tell the listeners and the viewers what the memorial service was like at Nagasaki this year, and tell the listeners whether you think the G7 meeting in Hiroshima earlier this year, where for the first time they recommended or recommitted each state to strengthening disarmament and non-proliferation efforts towards the ultimate goal of a world without nuclear weapons. Was that pledge of the G7 significant? Why or why not?
Thank you, Scott. Good morning from Nagasaki. Unfortunately, this year, the big typhoon hit the area, so the ceremony was shrunk to a very small meeting inside the building instead of at the Peace Park. This is an important event for Hibakishas and also for Nagasaki citizens to pray for the victims and also reconfirm our commitment to the abolition of nuclear weapons. And typically we have speakers from mayor from Nagasaki and Hibakisha representative, and also a speech from Prime Minister and Secretary General for United Nations and so on. But this year, only 3 speakers, unfortunately. But mayor typically declares peace declaration every year. This is very important for Nagasaki. And this year, the new mayor elected, Mr. Suzuki, gave a speech. And this is a very powerful speech. And in that speech, he acknowledged the significance of G7 summit, as you said, that this is reconfirming the commitment to no nuclear war. And this is very important. Unfortunately, though, he also criticized the statement that it includes a sentence, the value of nuclear weapons to deter the nuclear attack. And deterrence is not a concept actually accepted by the Hibakisha. Abolition of nuclear weapons is the goal. And in his speech, he said that I hereby appeal to the leaders of nuclear states and countries under the nuclear umbrella. Now is the time to show courage and make a decision to break free from dependence nuclear deterrence. And very similar sentence is also included in the Hiroshima mayor's declaration. He said, however, leaders around the world must confront the reality that nuclear threats now being voiced by certain policymakers reveal the folly of nuclear deterrence theory. And even the governor of Hiroshima prefecture, he had a very strong questions. I'd like to ask these nuclear deterrentists, how do you bear responsibility for the lives of innocent Ukrainian citizens who are losing their lives at this very moment? Ukraine is being invaded not because the country abandoned its nuclear arsenal, but because Russia's invasion cannot be stopped due to its possession of nuclear weapons. So basically, Hiroshima and Nagasaki citizens and the Hibakushiras deny the deterrence theory. And that's the commitment we confirm at the ceremony. Thank you.
Well, I think you have set up the first question for Sharon perfectly here, because Sharon, your article is critiquing deterrence. You have a wonderful section about what you call the narrative of necessity. And you write, rather than a strategic necessity, deterrence may be institutionalized behavior accepted because it has always been practiced rather than because it makes sense. Tell the listeners what you mean by this.
Sure. So first of all, Scott, Tatsu, it's nice to be with you both here. So when nuclear weapons were invented in 1945, the strategy for using them became deterrence, and it's still deterrence. So this is the idea that you purposefully dissuade an adversary from taking action you don't want them to take because of the threat of immeasurable pain and suffering, just the type of suffering that can only be caused by nuclear weapons. And deterrence is still the strategy guiding our nuclear weapons force structure and planning. But is this because deterrence is a great means of achieving security? Or is this really because the national security establishment, like all bureaucracies, essentially gets stuck? So bureaucracies aren't good at innovating, and past choices become kind of standard operating procedures. And because they're standard, they're not reconsidered, they're not compared against new options, they're not compared against new alternatives. They remain in place because of tradition. Now, you could say these traditions, these standard ways of doing things, they make it easier to plan, to budget, to train expertise. It's easier to consistently make decisions about nuclear weapons if you assume deterrence is the proper strategy. So assuming deterrence was the correct choice back in the 1940s, it also absolves us of actually reconsidering some fairly uncomfortable questions, such as, is it necessary to base our national security on a threat to commit suicide or on a threat to commit genocide against other people? So let me provide just a brief and hopefully contemporary illustration that will appeal to people that are listening. The Barbie movie, right? So some of you have seen the Barbie movie. I mean, Barbie, after being initially accepted, I mean, she was the first girl doll that allowed people to project their ambitions through her. Well, but then she got into trouble because she had a really unrealistic body type. And so she evolved. And today you can get a Barbie with different skin tone, hair type, body type. You can get a Barbie with acne, with missing limbs. She changed because the expectations American had of what it means to be feminine changed. So if you contrast this with the Oppenheimer movie, at the very beginning, this whole movie is about Oppenheimer struggling with the basic question at the core of deterrence. Does our national security really rest on the threat to kill so many people? Does it have to do this? The problem is, unlike Barbie, we stopped wrestling with this question and we assumed the answer was yes. That threatening to kill potentially a good percentage of life on this planet is an appropriate way to achieve our national security. So I'm not saying it is or it isn't, although you can probably guess what my answer would be. I'm saying that ethics requires us to repeatedly ask and examine this question. And that's something we're not doing. So let me actually, Scott, turn this to you. So I've just argued bureaucracies get used to practicing something that then becomes an unexamined routine. Well, does something similar happen when militaries are asked to avoid civilian casualties? I mean, in your piece, you argue quite eloquently that you should focus targeting on military power and senior political leadership, use conventional weapons instead of nuclear where possible, and reject the doctrine of belligerent reprisal. And all these things would reduce civilian casualties. But how can we expect the national security bureaucracy to actually implement these ideas that you present in your article?
I think you're right, Sharon, that organizations tend to follow routines. They get into habits. They repeat what they said last time around. And you see that a lot when you look at national security policies, such as the nuclear posture review. But I think that sometimes when you point out facts or you have disputes, even a slow moving bureaucracy can change. And let me give a couple examples. It has been widely said by people in strategic command and then in other parts of the military that deterrence works because, look, we hinted that we might use nuclear weapons in 1991 against Saddam Hussein, and he didn't use nuclear weapons. So that shows that calculated ambiguity nuclear threats can be effective. As was pointed out in the National Academy of Sciences recent report on nuclear risk, that interpretation of what happened in 1991 is not accurate. And I think that it is going to be far less likely to be used again and again and again when it's been pointed out. The same thing happened with the Trump nuclear posture review statement, which repeated and actually recreated a old Stratcom figure. This is something that you comment on in your article, Sharon, that says that the number of people killed in the percentage of the world population killed in interstate wars dropped precipitously after the end of World War II, and claims it was because of nuclear weapons. But Jim Soros has a wonderful article that makes the argument that when the population increases, even if the percentage of people who even the number of people who die in wars stays the same, of course the number goes down. So this could easily be statistically refuted. I don't think that's going to be used again, because even people in the establishment, like Soros, who has a long career inside government, have ridiculed particular uses. Now, when it comes to killing civilians as a deliberate act, here, I don't know what is in the classified version of the nuclear posture review. But I do know that the Stratcom JAGs strongly believe that direct targeting of civilians is illegal. They do say, and they have raised questions about whether rejecting belligerent reprisal would be valuable or not. So there are some people in the JAG Corps, active, not just former, who have raised that question. And in a recent article in International Security, 4 longstanding writers of nuclear posture reviews said that they would never have advocated the direct targeting of civilians, even in reprisal to an attack on our civilians. So I take that as a promising note. I would note, however, in the same article, a former State Department high official from the Trump administration said, of course we target civilians in response to an attack on our civilians, and incorrectly cited some texts that were not government sponsored texts to support his position. So I hope that there's pushback against belligerent reprisal, and it is one of those acts that could be, I think, usefully changed by outside criticisms. Tatsu, one thing that I've been very interested in on the Japanese side is the concern about no first use. I know that you have personally advocated for no first use, as have I, but I don't know the position of the Japanese government as well as you do. I know that there are some concerns that a no first use doctrine, which I think would be a step in the right direction, by some thinks that that would be a weakening of a deterrent posture. What are your thoughts on that?
So the government official statement on no first use is that this is just a declaration policy. There is no way to verify other countries' will. So unless all nuclear weapon states agreed on this policy with some kind of verification, Japanese government cannot support the idea because we cannot defend ourselves. That's the official statement. And also, I heard that government officials discussing the idea that nuclear deterrence should also deter non-nuclear attack like chemical or biological weapons. So no first use cannot guarantee the protection against non-nuclear attacks. Those are the two main reasons. And my thought is that can you imagine that the United States or Japan will ask United States use a first nuclear attack for any occasion in this region? And it's very difficult to think about those regions, those cases. And Japan actually had a dilemma that most of the Japanese public also in favor of abolition of nuclear weapons and signing the TPNW, Treaty of Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. At the same time, majority of the public support extended nuclear deterrence. And that's the dilemma we face. So no first use also is not openly publicly debated in Japan, unfortunately.
It is unfortunate. Can you tell me what are the scenarios that are worrying people the most? Is it an aggressive China, or are they mostly worried about North Korea?
I think both. North Korea, occasionally launched a missile in the area. Every time they launch the missiles so-called J alert, which is a signal coming from the government that you should hide and now evacuate. And that kind of things will probably frighten the people. At the same time, Chinese nuclear expansion is also a very serious concern. So I was surprised to see the public polling that the majority of the public is now supporting the Japanese new defense security policy to increase the defense budget almost double in the next 5 years. So this is particularly Taiwan issue is a main concern for Japan.
Sure. Before we continue on, I want to remind listeners that if you have a question, you can put it into the chat, and we'll reserve time at the end. Please submit via the chat, and we'll have some questions as we go forward. Sharon, you set up a discussion of Oppenheimer by mentioning it in your opening comment.
And
I
Barbie.
wondered if you could comment about your views on the film. You're correct, I believe, in saying that there hasn't been nearly enough debate in the United States on the ethics of deterrence, and we often, as a country, sleepwalk on these topics, leaving it only up to the experts or people on the inside. But what's your view about the movie and its potential to arouse public opinion?
Well, I'm not a expert on the relationship between advocacy and the media, but the torment and the personal concerns that Oppenheimer goes through, the contradictions he tries to face in the movie, well, and that he faced in real life, between choosing to do something that he thought was necessary for national security that also caused such tremendous destruction. Plus his knowledge, which you can see in the movie, I mean, it's no spoiler alert here, that he knew, and the physicists knew, that it wasn't that hard to make a nuclear weapon, that others would do it. And from the very beginning, they could foresee this problem, which Oppenheimer calls two scorpions in a bottle. And I think the ethics of nuclear weapons requires all people who are governed by a nuclear umbrella to have that conversation with each other. And it's a difficult, with themselves, it's a difficult conversation. I think that's one of the reasons we don't talk about nuclear weapons more than we do. Because to ask yourself, is it worth my security to threaten to kill myself, which is one question, but it's also another to say, is my security worth threatening to kill huge numbers of other people? And, you know, Scott, you mentioned that you think there might be a possibility or a seriousness about not targeting civilians, but that's in the first strike, right? I mean, deterrence is also based on the notion that you'll deter escalation by the promise of future, even more devastating strikes. And at some point, that escalation means you can't avoid civilian casualties. And if you look at if you look at every single nuclear posture review, I don't believe there's ever a single statement in any of them about how you would control escalation. So even planning on that first strike or even a second strike against solely military targets is irrevocably linked to the threat that you will escalate to all-out war and complete destruction.
Well, certainly there is, I think, that tendency. And what I have argued is that we should, as a matter of policy, follow what I've called the nuclear necessity principle in an article with Jeffrey Lewis, arguing that we should never use a nuclear weapon against any target that could be destroyed with high probability by a conventional weapon. Now, some people on the legal side will say, yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and that would be appropriate. But some have criticized that view, saying that you're going to reduce collateral damage if you follow such a policy. I said, yes, that's the reason why we want to have the policy. And then they say, but reducing collateral damage will weaken deterrence. And I find this really troubling. In the most recent book on this subject, Managing Nuclear Operations in the 21st Century, Robert Kaler, the former STRATCOM commander, writes, as commander, I fully embraced U.S. policy to apply legal principles to nuclear plans and welcomed the clarity that came with the academic and policy debates about those principles. But I was concerned that increasingly restrictive constraints and legal interpretations appropriate to conventional war may not be achievable or desirable if carried to extremes when applied to nuclear weapons and their unavoidable collateral effects. The risks associated with those collateral effects is a major factor that contributes to deterrence. But my own view is that if you're using collateral effects for deterrence, it's no longer collateral. And I found that statement by Robert Kaler, whose views I have long admired, to be very disturbing. So I think that we do need to maintain strong deterrence, but I think that reducing the role of nuclear weapons in that deterrence would both make it more legal and more ethical. And I don't think that deterrence has to be based on either deliberate or collateral damage against civilians.
Can I just step in just for a minute?
Yes.
Because we're talking about this is a conversation between Americans, Russians, Chinese, the Japanese covered by the nuclear umbrella from the United States, and other countries that are covered by the nuclear umbrella. But we also have to invite in all of the other countries in the world, because as you both well know, if nuclear weapons are used, you're not going to contain the damage to just the belligerents. And if you look at international law and And Scott, this is your area, not mine. But the arguments about proportionality. If you're not involved in the conflict in the first place, you shouldn't be involved in the response to the conflict, right? Yeah, but with nuclear weapons, the externalities, that devastation isn't going to be just confined to the combatants. And I think that's also an ethical element that involves everybody in the world, not just the countries that are covered by deterrence and a nuclear umbrella.
And I think that even our estimates of collateral damage are often way off. There's been a lot of work done on risks of nuclear winter, but that it's been disputed by people on the inside whether nuclear winter really would occur. And as far as I know, therefore, the potential risks of nuclear winter are not included when one talks on the inside about collateral damage effects. Moreover, the work by the Stanford medical school professor, Paul Wise, has shown that in conventional conflicts, more people often die after the war is over because of the damage to healthcare systems that occur in a war than actually die during the war. I think that is a really important thought when it comes to nuclear weapons as well. If Paul's right, and I believe the statistics really demonstrate that he is, it would suggest that the damage of that other form long after a war is over, just as in Japan, the number of people who died in your city, Tatsu, and in Hiroshima, continued dying for years afterwards.
Yes.
And I think that would occur in a widespread manner as well.
Yeah, we did the simulation in a limited nuclear war in this region. And for Chinese use of nuclear weapons first in Taiwan conflict, and the United States responded. The first thing we realized is that the likely first target are not in the United States, but in the US bases in South Korea and Taiwan, killing many civilians in both South Korea and Japan. And not in Taiwan, so based in Japan. So many people will be killed first, not in the United States, but in South Korea and Japan. The second is that only 24 nuclear weapons are used in our case, but still.
In your war game scenario.
Yeah, in our scenario,
Okay.
24 nuclear weapons were used. And still the casualties.
Quotation marks around only.
Only.
24 is still a lot, but.
Only still a lot.
Yeah.
2.6 million people will be killed within a year.
Yeah.
And also radioactive fallout, as Sharon suggested, not only in the region, but covered Southeast Asia and Guam, and Pacific, South Pacific. So only unlimited nuclear weapons could kill millions of people. And this is a simulation we did for our study. It's frightening.
Okay. Have the Russian threats to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine influenced the debates in Japan?
Yes. People started saying this is Ukraine. We are Taiwan is the next to Ukraine, and we could be involved in the nuclear war.
To me, I thought the most worrisome threat that Putin made was in September last year when he announced the annexation of parts of the Donbass and said that now that they're attacked, he'd consider using nuclear weapons, and then added that there is a precedent for using nuclear weapons to end a war. And particularly mentioned Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Right.
Hinting that he might use nuclear weapons not on the battlefield to, say, destroy a Ukrainian battalion, but against a city to deliberately coerce or attempt to coerce the Ukrainian government into giving up. I don't know what US officials said to their counterparts. President Biden said that there would be catastrophic responses to Russia, but did not specify what those costs would be. I hope that someone said, regardless of what you think about the history of Nagasaki and Hiroshima and whether the bombing contributed or didn't to the ending of the war, the fact was that in 1945, Japan could not hit back at the United States. Any use of nuclear weapons by Russia today, I think Ukraine could hit back, and the United States, I hope, said that we would ensure that they have that capability without saying exactly what it would be. Now, that's a form of deterrence, I would think, but it's not necessarily nuclear deterrence. Sharon, do you agree with that, or what are your thoughts on the dangers with Ukraine?
So I think when we talk about deterrence, we have to remember deterrence is this is an age-old strategy. Parents try and deter their kids from doing bad things. This is a means of persuasion. The problem with deterrence is when you add the destructive capability of nuclear weapons and you link that deterrence to a rung of escalation that always ends in the same place. And to quote former head of Strategic Command talking about their war games, it always ends bad. It ends in thermonuclear war. So deterrence isn't the problem. It's deterrence with nuclear weapons that's the problem.
Yeah, there was a military war game inside the White House in 2016, so the second Obama term, which was quite good at predicting the future, in that it had Russia going not to Ukraine, but into the Baltics, into a NATO country, trying to grab a piece of land and on the argument that the people there were being persecuted by the Russian speakers there were being persecuted. And when the conventional invasion bogged down, Russia used one nuclear weapon against a NATO airbase. According to Fred Kaplan's book, The Bomb, there's a debate at the level of the second level, the deputies level at the National Security Council, with some saying, well, we should respond with nuclear weapons, and others, and eventually their position won, saying, no, we should respond conventionally. We should try escalation control by attacking military bases inside Russia, which they had not yet done in this scenario, but do it conventionally. That's a form of escalation control and deterrence, but one that would not necessarily lead to a rapid escalation. However, the next day, the principals, the secretaries of defense, national security advisor, et cetera, met, and their recommendation for a policy would be to use nuclear weapons against those bases. They were told by the red team, people playing the Russians, that if you do that, the Russians are going to have to use nuclear weapons against the United States. So instead, they used nuclear weapons against Belarus, which was not engaged in the attack. The deputies reportedly had T-shirts made that said the deputies had the right idea. Now, I think they did. I'm pleased that some of those deputies have been members of the Biden administration since that time.
But such situations like this also bring in questions about human decision-making in a crisis.
Absolutely.
This was a war game, and I'm sure the players experienced some level of stress. But everything we know about human behavior says that when we're in a crisis, we don't necessarily make the right decision. We don't think rationally. If you look at some theories, there's the notion of when you're in a crisis, when you should play it safe, instead you go for broke. And most of the ideas about pathologies of decision-making suggest that in a nuclear crisis, things are not going to go as planned, and they're not going to go well. So there's another element to deterrence that I think also needs deterrence with nuclear weapons that needs to be re-examined. And that's the ethics of making a threat, which it may not be within human rationality to control or to consider if it ever has to be carried out.
Can you briefly tell listeners about the scenarios that you've been running to have individuals playing the president coming under the threat of a nuclear attack?
Sure. So my colleague Moritz Kut and I have a virtual reality program, right? Everybody wants to do some VR, but in our case, it's a virtual reality crisis where you're the president of the United States and you experience a nuclear attack. You get options. You can ask any question you want. You can literally do anything you want. And we try to see what response people make. And almost everyone picks one of the nuclear options that's presented to them and uses nuclear weapons in a very escalatory fashion. And afterwards you ask them, well, did you intend to do that? Or is that what you wanted? And it's not clear that that was their goal at all. So the choices that were presented to them really carried the day, as opposed to them controlling the situation, acting presidential, and doing what would best achieve their goals.
Yes, I was
Can I?
fortunate to participate in that, and it was really fascinating, Sharon, because you had such pressure to execute quickly with a simulated military officer telling you what the options are and how little time you had to make your decision. I believe I resisted and said, I'm going to get the helicopter and get out of here, and I do not want you to attack. But the pressure to conform was enormous.
Do you remember if you asked if the lawyers had vetted the targeting options for civilian casualties?
I would certainly have wanted to know all of it.
But there's a legal question for Japan regarding extended nuclear deterrence.
Oh, please.
Recent paper by Kimiaki Kawai said that Japan is ratified Geneva Convention of Additional Protocol 1, but Japan has been silent on the legality of extended nuclear deterrence. If Japan considers Additional Protocol 1 does not apply to the use of nuclear weapons, Japan is supposed to assume that if Japan is attacked, then the United States can attack against civilian population. But if we have to assume Japan has already been attacked, means that many Japanese already suffered from a nuclear attack, and then the Japanese public will ask the Japanese government to request the United States to attack against civilians in the enemy country. That's the first question. If Japan considers Additional Protocol does apply to use of nuclear weapons, then the question arises to Japanese government. Japan cannot be asked, probably legally allowed to request the United States to carry out the reprisal against the enemy under this extended nuclear deterrence. So legality of extended nuclear deterrence has not been debated in Japan much. So he raises a fundamental question about the legality of extended nuclear deterrence. This is a very interesting question.
Sure. I'm going to turn to some questions from people who are watching. And the first one's for you, Sharon. It's from the philosopher Ned Dobos in Australia, saying that you're right, parents try to deter their children, governments try to deter their citizens. Those things happen all the time, but they fail a lot too. For example, in the pandemic, consider what happened, he says. After governments issued lockdown orders and then backed them up with severe penalties, most citizens obeyed, but some went out of their way to openly defy the restrictions that their government placed. Criminologists are very sensitive to the ways in which deterrent threats can be counterproductive. Is there a similar risk in international relations, and why aren't we talking more about that?
So this is a great question. It's a great observation, because what the question suggests is when you try and deter someone, you could deter them, or you could get the opposite. You could get them just going ahead with the behavior almost in spite of you. So the problem is you don't know in a deterrent situation in advance which of those behaviors you're going to get. There's an element of probability and luck. And there's an argument that you don't know which of those behaviors you're going to get until you actually see it. So when you add the destructive power of nuclear weapons to that equation, it means you are gambling with significant casualties and significant destructive capability. And you know that it's possibly going to work, and it's possibly not going to work. I almost feel like quantum probability here. There are all these probabilities of what could come out. But it seems to me worthy of an ethical conversation, of a conversation about ethics, about using such destructive capability when you cannot know in advance with any surety what the outcome will be. And the outcome could be what you want, not what you want, or almost anything in between.
Tatsu, I think this question is for you from Martha Crawford. We've been talking about what Americans think mostly and what Japanese think, but you also have many colleagues that you interact with from China and from South Korea. How are they debating questions about ethics and nuclear disarmament or ethics and nuclear deterrence?
Honestly, I don't know much that the legal ethical question that they are discussing. When we meet those people, they basically South Korean people, they basically are afraid of attack from North Korea, and they are debating actually credibility of extended nuclear deterrence. And
Right.
so that's the first thing I heard from them. From Chinese, I think, I'm not sure they discuss much, but their policy of no force use, if that is still maintained, that may be based on your suggestion on the so-called calculated ambiguity should be excluded from your suggestion. This is very close to so-called sole purpose policy, right? And so maybe I think they may be debating ethical legal question regarding nuclear weapons on that perspective, no force use.
Well, certainly the public opinion in South Korea has shifted to being in favor of acquiring nuclear weapons.
Right.
There have been occasional flirtations with that idea from high-ranking government or presidential candidates. Lauren Sukin at the London School of Economics has a very interesting article that shows that some of the increase in public support in South Korea for getting nuclear weapons comes not from people who think the U.S. threat to use nuclear weapons in defense of South Korea isn't credible enough. That's the standard explanation.
Right.
But many of them favor getting nuclear weapons because they think the United States was, as she puts it, too credible under Donald Trump. That you don't use nuclear weapons when they don't want us to use nuclear weapons, when it would be utterly irrational to use nuclear weapons. And she found that this recent growth comes from both sides, sort of a left side and a right side.
Very interesting.
And that was particularly alarming, which I found pretty interesting.
Can I just make a brief comment here? These polling questions, I mean, I always find them fascinating. But the questions always ask, are you in favor of getting nuclear weapons? It's never asked, are you in favor of threatening to sacrifice your entire country in the name of your security, which is essentially what you're threatening to do when you get nuclear weapons. Or it's never asked, are you willing to become a nuclear target of North Korea, China, whomever, in order to guarantee your own security? Would you be better off if you were a nuclear target than not being a nuclear target? So I think the phrasing of these questions also is something that should be examined, because it's actually hiding the value trade-off that you're asking people to make.
Well, but I think in this case, Sharon, the South Koreans already feel they are a nuclear target. They know because Kim Jong-un says so loudly and so often. So for them, it is a question of having what I think they see as a retaliatory capability, and not as a first use capability. But I don't think they've thought through all the potential consequences that could exist in that kind of scenario.
But I tend to agree with Sharon that the term nuclear umbrella is very misleading, that people think that we are protected by the umbrella, but there's no umbrella physically. And as you said, that nuclear umbrella means that we are asking the United States to threaten to kill the civilians or the enemy's people with the nuclear weapons. And people don't think that way with the term nuclear umbrella. So we have to change the term nuclear umbrella to something else, or nuclear threatening or something like that.
Yeah. The umbrella is a cute metaphor that
Yes.
people very easily. There's a question from Pierce Corden, I believe for me, about what can you say more about belligerent reprisal and how does it relate to nuclear weapons? So belligerent reprisal is a rather obscure but very important legal concept, which says that you can break a law that you have signed, a treaty law, in response to somebody else previously breaking a law, and in order, or at least in an attempt, to bring them back into legal conformity. So if someone breaks a treaty, you can take an act that is proportionate with what they've done. It doesn't have to be identical, but can be an attempt, deliberate attempt to say, I'm going to do this until you stop doing what you're doing. Let's bring them back into conformity. Now, the additional protocol to the Geneva Conventions did not rule out the concept of belligerent reprisal. But what it did rule out was belligerent reprisal against prisoners, against nuclear power plants, and against civilians. So you can't do any of those three things. You could attack a military target, or you could break another part of an agreement. You could deploy more anti-ballistic missiles than you had an agreement to if that treaty was still in place. You could do other things, but you can't target those three categories. Now, the United States, when it signed the Geneva Conventions, said that they signed the additional protocols, said that they did not apply to nuclear weapons, and said that the threat of belligerent reprisal if someone attacks our civilians, threat to respond in kind adds to deterrence. Alan Weiner and I argue, however, that that statement made 30 years ago has not been repeated by others. And indeed, President Obama and even the Trump NPR said directly that we will not deliberately target civilians. So to me, that suggests that the United States agrees that we will not do that even under belligerent reprisal. It just doesn't want to say so because it thinks that that adds an element of deterrence. So that's my view on belligerent reprisal today, although I know that there are others, such as Chris Ford, writing in International Security, who disagree with that position. So here's a question, I think, for all of us, but I wish we had a Russian specialist with us. Maybe Sharon, you can start because you've read more into this than either Tatsu or I think. What were informed conversations in Russia today about nuclear weapons? What can you tell the audience about some of the academic writings that have been going on over the war in Ukraine?
So let me not lay claim to being an expert on Russian public opinion or Russian attitudes at all on the subject. But I have been reading some of the things coming out of Putin's council about the potential use of nuclear weapons, including by people who in the 1990s were all in favor of US-Russian cooperation. And some of those arguments, or couple of those arguments have been as follows, that the United States is evil and it's our responsibility to use nuclear weapons to rid the world of this problem. Now, we understand that some of us Russians will die because the US has a secure second strike on submarines, but some of us will live, more of us than them, and therefore it is our moral duty to undertake this on behalf of the world. Now, let's hope that's just a couple of folks, and even though they are advisors to Putin, the notion that it's your responsibility to use nuclear weapons on behalf of other people, and the notion that you somehow win if there are a few more of you left than the other side, I mean, that's completely besides the point, right? Nobody's going to win a nuclear war. But this is the argument that it's too convenient to make if you're, for example, a military planner thinking that, I mean, in conventional military terms, the more targets you destroy of the enemy, the better off you are. But in nuclear terms, that's not the appropriate calculation at all.
So we have a question about the NPT and the TPNW. The NPT is a non-proliferation treaty, of which Japan is a signatory and is actually, one of the leading non-nuclear weapon states advocating that others join the treaty. The TPNW, the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, the Japanese government has refused to join. Can you explain why to our listeners and also explain your own position?
The official government statement on TPNW is that unless the nuclear weapon states join this treaty, it will not eliminate any nuclear weapon. So Japan has to work with nuclear weapons countries to proceed for nuclear disarmament, and TPNW is not the right way to work with nuclear weapon states. That's the official position of the Japanese government. And my position is that that is probably true for short term, but the TPNW is based on the spirit of the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons, which Japanese government is also pushing very strongly forward in the NPT review conference every time. And so Japan can agree with the spirit of the TPNW. And there are many clauses, for instance, that TPNW has a clause to help support the victims of a nuclear attack and also nuclear weapon test. Japan has probably the only country who has experience of the victims of the nuclear weapons, and Japan can help to those people who are suffering from the nuclear tests and nuclear weapons. And secondly, also verification of nuclear weapons. Japan has a technical know-how to help. So I would say that Japan can at least to help the spirit of the TPNW and join the at least for as an observer to TPNW at this moment.
We have a question from Nitish Vaidyanathan asking whether anyone in the panel knows how India and Pakistan are reacting to the invasion of Ukraine and the nuclear threats. Have any of you read or seen? The only thing that I know to answer Nitish's question is that Modi was at the G7 meeting, right, Tatsu?
Yeah.
And so he signed on to the nuclear disarmament, the sort of Article 6.
That's right.
Pledge, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah.
And it has also been reported that that he told Putin that using nuclear weapons in Ukraine would be a real disaster.
Right.
I don't know the exact words he used, and I have not seen any actions out of Pakistan.
But this also illustrates one of the problems with deterrence, right? Here we are trying to figure out what lessons other nuclear powers are taking from this conflict in Ukraine and Russia's nuclear saber rattling. If this was a proper theory, the lessons should be clear for all of us, but we could make arguments that nuclear powers could take lessons that are directly antagonistic towards each other.
Right. Yeah, Putin may be taking the lessons that nuclear threats work because the United States has not directly intervened, and others may be taking the lesson that nuclear threats do not work because we've given so much aid and have indirectly been involved in the war. And a reasonable person could take either lesson. So I think that's really fascinating. Well, we only have 2 more minutes. And Tatsu, were there any final thoughts that you wanted to share to our audience that we didn't get to in the questions in the Q&A?
I think for non-nuclear weapon states, negative security assurance is a very important policy that we can pursue. And we have not discussed much, but this is the moral responsibility for the nuclear weapon states not to attack the country without nuclear weapons. I hope that concept and that policy should be more assured with some kind of legally binding treaty or something like that. That will help much the assurance against nuclear attack for non-nuclear weapon states.
Great. Sharon, any last thoughts you want to share?
I would just say one of the things we haven't talked about is accountability and the ethics associated with the fact that only one person unchecked in the United States can make a decision to use the nuclear arsenal. So the notion that only the president gets to do this doesn't require advice or consent or even consultation with anyone else. That's something that I think is part of the conversation about ethics.
Excellent. Well, this marks the end of this, I think, really interesting seminar. I wanted to thank you, Sharon, and thank you, Tatsu, for joining, and especially thank all the members of the staff of the Carnegie Council and the Journal Ethics and International Affairs for trying to reignite what I think is a very important discussion that we have to have about the ethics or lack of ethics involved with nuclear deterrence. So thank you very much, and thank you especially, Tatsu, for joining us so early in the morning.
No.
Thank you, Sharon.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Scott.
Thank you very much.